nobody was laughing by the time 16-year-old Wyatt Carver was finished, but they were laughing when he arrived. That is the thing about a boy showing up alone to a farm equipment auction in Colby County, Kansas, in the summer of 1977, carrying a coffee tin with $340 in saved money and a handwritten notebook full of numbers that every mechanic in the county would have told him were wrong. The men in that auction yard had been buying and selling farm equipment since before Wyatt was born. They had seen hopeful buyers make poor decisions on summer mornings for decades. They knew what they were looking at when they looked at him. They thought they knew what happened over the next 3 hours, from the moment the auctioneer called the first lot to the moment the yard went quiet, became the kind of story that gets told at diners and feed stores for a generation. Not because of what Wyatt bought or what he paid, because of what he knew. He was 16 years old. He knew something that none of the adults in that yard had thought to find out. And when the moment came, he used it. If you have ever been underestimated or watched someone else be, you already know why the story matters. Iron ground is where those stories get told. Subscribe and stay with us. The Siebert sale barn sat off Highway 24, 3 miles east of the Colby town line, on a stretch of land that had been hosting farm equipment auctions twice a year since the spring of 1954. It was the kind of event that attracted serious buyers. Farmers liquidating equipment after retirement, estates being settled, dealers looking for units they could recondition and resell. The summer 1977 auction had drawn 63 registered bidders and an unofficial crowd of onlookers who came for the same reason people came to county fairs. Because something interesting might happen. Wyatt Carver arrived at 7:30 in the morning, an hour before registration opened. He had ridden his bicycle 14 miles from his family's farm outside Oakley because his mother needed the truck for work that day, and he had not wanted to miss the preview. He was lanky in the way 16-year-old farm boys are lanky, all bone and tendon, with hands that were already the hands of a working man. Sunburned across the bridge of his nose, a shirt that had been washed so many times the collar had gone soft. Work boots that were slightly too large because he was still growing into them. He locked the bicycle to a fence post near the entry gate. He smoothed his shirt down across his chest. He walked into the preview area and began inspecting equipment. This is where the laughter started. It was not cruel laughter, to be accurate about it. It was the laughter of men who found the situation improbable. A boy 16 years old moving through rows of farm equipment with a notebook and a flashlight and a short length of baling wire folded in his back pocket. Peering under hoods, checking serial numbers, crouching to look at undercarriages, doing what the serious buyers did at the age when serious buyers were still in school. Hollis Merritt, who ran a used equipment dealership in Colby and had been coming to this auction for 14 years, watched Wyatt for a few minutes from across the yard. Merritt was 44 years old that summer. He had a face that had spent a lifetime outside, and a voice that had spent a lifetime explaining to hopeful men why their equipment was worth less than they thought. He turned to the man beside him, a dealer out of Norton named Elvin Pratt, and said just loud enough to carry somebody's boy playing farmer. A few men within earshot agreed. It was good-natured. Wyatt heard it and kept working. The equipment Wyatt was most interested in was a 1953 Oliver 88-row crop tractor lot, 14 on the auction list. It sat at the end of the north row, looking the way machines look when they have been through a lot. And nobody has been kind to them in recent years. The paint was gone in patches. One rear fender was missing entirely, and the front axle was visibly bent, not severely, but enough that the tractor sat at a tilt that any experienced eye would catch immediately. Any experienced eye would catch it and move on. The bent axle was why the Oliver was priced low. The auction catalog had estimated it at $200 to $400, depending on bidder interest. It was the kind of lot that attracted parts buyers and people with more optimism than mechanical knowledge. The serious buyers had looked at it and walked past. Hollis Merritt had looked at it for 30 seconds. Wyatt Carver spent 22 minutes on it. He had a flashlight. He had a notebook. He had a compression gauge his grandfather had given him 2 years earlier, when the old man had decided Wyatt was ready to use it responsibly. And he had the baling wire for checking hydraulic fittings. He checked the engine compression, all 4 cylinders, systematically recording each number in his notebook, in a hand that was steadier than most 16-year-old hands have any business being. He checked the oil. He checked the transmission through the inspection cover. He got under the tractor and looked at the front axle from below, then took 2 measurements with a folding ruler, then wrote them down, and sat back on his heels for a long moment studying the numbers he had just recorded. The men watching thought this was funny. A boy with a compression gauge, a boy with a folding ruler, a boy who had probably read a book about tractors and decided he was ready. Then Wyatt did something the men in that yard had not seen before. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook that had clearly been carried by someone for a very long time. The leather was soft and darkened at the corners. He opened it to a specific page. He compared what was on the page to the numbers he had just written down. He closed the notebook. He closed his own notebook. He stood up unhurried and walked toward the registration table. A farmer named Orell Tipton, who had been standing at the edge of the preview area with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, had watched the last part of this without saying anything. Tipton was 71 years old. He had been farming in Thomas County since before the war. He had known Wyatt's grandfather. When Wyatt walked past him, Tipton nodded once, a small, tight nod that Wyatt returned without breaking stride. Nobody else saw the exchange, or if they did not understand what it meant. Tipton went back to his coffee, but he did not leave the preview area. He stood exactly where he was waiting to see what happened next. At the registration table, Wyatt gave his name. Wyatt Carver. His address. Outside Oakley. His age. 16. The registration clerk, a woman in her 50s named Doreen, who had been clerking this auction for 11 years, looked up at him, then looked back down at her registration sheet and wrote the number 16 in the age column without comment. She had seen a lot in 11 years. She was not paid to have opinions about any of it. Wyatt deposited his coffee tin on the counter. Doreen counted out the $340. In a practiced hand, rubber banded it, wrote him a receipt, and handed him a paper bidder slip with the number 47 printed on it. Hollis Merritt watched the coffee tin get counted from across the yard and shook his head. He turned to Elvin Pratt again. "What is he planning to do?" Merritt said, with $340 at a farm auction. Pratt shrugged. "Buy himself an education, most likely." Merritt smiled at that. A 44-year-old dealer's smile, easy and unconcerned. Then he went back to studying his own catalog. He had 3 pieces of equipment he was there to bid on, and a boy with a coffee tin was not going to affect any of them. He was wrong about that too, though not in the way he expected. Let me tell you about Wyatt Carver. Because the 16-year-old who arrived at that auction with a coffee tin and a compression gauge and a leather-bound notebook did not get his knowledge from thin air. He was born in 1961 in a farmhouse outside Oakley, Kansas, the only son of Thomas and Marietta Carver. His father, Thomas, had farmed the family's 80 acres in Thomas County with a patience and a steadiness that the men who worked around him had always admired. His grandfather, Silas Thomas's father, had farmed the same ground for 40 years before that. 3 generations on the same quarter section, each one handing the land forward a little more, worked a little more, understood. Thomas Carver died in the spring of 1974. Wyatt was 13 years old. A power takeoff shaft on a haybine caught the cuff of Thomas's work pants on a Tuesday afternoon in April, and by the time the neighbor who had been working alongside him got the machine shut down, there was not very much anyone could do. There had been no warning. It had been a maintenance miss, a cotter pin that should have been replaced a year earlier. The kind of mistake that a careful man could make on a careful morning, because even careful men make mistakes. After the funeral, Marietta went back to work. She had been keeping the books at the Oakley Feed and Seed for 3 years, 3 days a week. She went to 5 days a week. She took a second job doing payroll for a small trucking outfit out of Colby 1 weekend a month. She was 39 years old when her husband died. She did not remarry. She did not cry where Wyatt could see her. She set the farm up to lease out the cropland and kept just enough acreage around the house to run a few head of cattle. And she made the calculations that would keep the mortgage paid and her son fed and the lights on. And then she made those calculations again every month for the next decade, because the ground under their feet was not going to stay under their feet without her math. Wyatt understood in the way 13-year-olds understand things that the farm his father had inherited was no longer a farm in any active sense. It was a property with a note attached to it. Meridian Bank held that note. The payment was $240 a month. Marietta paid it every month. She had never missed one. She never would. Silas Carver. Wyatt's grandfather was 71 years old when his son Thomas died. He lived in a small house 2 miles from Thomas and Marietta's place on the original homestead, where he had raised Thomas and Thomas's 2 sisters. Silas had not worked his own ground in 5 years. He had handed the land to Thomas in 1969 and moved himself and his tools into the small house and the equipment shed behind it. And he had spent the last 5 years of his active life doing what he called useful puttering, fixing things for neighbors, teaching anyone who wanted to learn, keeping his tools sharp. When Thomas died, Silas did something he had not done in 5 years. He walked the 2 miles from his small house to Thomas and Marietta's equipment shed, and he spent an entire afternoon going through the machines his son had been using, checking every one of them, cleaning every one of them, making a list on a legal pad of what needed doing and what was safe and what was not. Then he walked home. He did this every week for the next year. Marietta never asked him to. He never asked if he could. He just came, and he worked, and he left. And Wyatt, who was 13, and then 14 during that year, followed him. The winter of 1974 was the winter Wyatt started carrying a notebook of his own. Silas had noticed around November of that year that the boy was following him with a focus that was different from the distracted following of a child. Wyatt was watching the way a student watches, asking questions the way a student asks, remembering answers the way a student remembers. Silas, who had raised a son and 2 daughters, and had taught many neighbors' boys over the decades, recognized the look. He had seen it before. He had not seen it in his own family since Thomas had been 14, and had first started asking the questions that had eventually made him the steady, careful farmer he had become before a cotter pin cost him his life. One afternoon in December of 1974, in the equipment shed behind the Oakley house, Silas pulled out a compression gauge, a simple brass tool with a rubber hose and a pressure dial. He set it on the workbench between himself and Wyatt. "Every machine tells you the truth," he said, "if you know how to listen." And then he taught Wyatt over the next 2 hours how to read a cylinder the way a doctor reads a chest. Listen for what the sound tells you about what is happening inside. Numbers do not lie. The machine does not want to deceive you. It only wants to be understood. Wyatt wrote down every number Silas called out that afternoon. He wrote them in a spiral notebook with a green cover. He still had that notebook in the summer of 1977. It was in a drawer in the equipment shed. The first entries were in his grandfather's hand. The later entries were in his own. Silas Carver died on a Wednesday morning in April of 1975. He was 72 years old. He had not been ill. He had gone out to his shed to start a small engine he was repairing for a neighbor, and the neighbor had come by an hour later to pick it up. And he had found Silas sitting in his work chair with his hands on his thighs, his eyes closed, gone as quietly as a man can go. The neighbor, whose name was Arlen Dowd, sat with him for a while before he drove to the Oakley feed store to find Marietta and tell her. He told Marietta, and then he drove to the Carver place to tell Wyatt, because he knew that Wyatt at 14 had been spending more time with Silas than anyone else alive. Silas left Wyatt his tool chest. 40 years of carefully maintained hand tools in a wooden chest Silas had built himself in 1948. In the weeks after the funeral, Marietta and Wyatt moved the chest and the 43 binders the 2 miles from Silas's homestead to the equipment shed behind the Oakley house, because that was where Wyatt would be doing the work, and because Silas's small house was going to be sold to settle his affairs. The chest and the binders found their places on the workbench and the top shelf in the same order Silas had kept them, and they did not move again. He did not leave a letter. He did not leave instructions. He left the tools and the binders, and he trusted that the boy knew what they were for. After Silas died, Wyatt spent most of his free hours in that shed. He was 14 years old, going on 15. He had, within a year of his grandfather's death, begun taking on the informal maintenance of 2 neighboring farms, whose owners had noticed his work and started bringing him problems they could not solve themselves. He charged nothing. He was 15 years old, and he was doing work that professional mechanics charged $35 an hour for. He had also, in the month since Silas's death, developed a specific area of knowledge that would matter enormously on the morning of the Colby County auction. He had taught himself the Oliver 88, every model year, every variation, every known fault, and its fix. From the technical bulletins Silas had collected since 1954, he knew the Oliver 88 the way you know something you have read about so thoroughly that the knowledge stops feeling like information and starts feeling like instinct. The Oliver 88 row crop deserves its own introduction, because without understanding what Wyatt knew about it, the auction makes no sense. The 1953 Oliver 88 was a 4-cylinder gasoline tractor producing 43 horsepower. A solid mid-size workhorse, popular in the Kansas wheat country through the 1950s. It was known for a durable engine and a transmission that, if maintained correctly, lasted effectively forever. It was also known among the people who had serviced a lot of them for one specific front axle issue that appeared in the 1952 and 1953 model years. A design tolerance in the front axle kingpin assembly that, under certain conditions, caused the front axle to develop a visible lateral cant. A tilt, a lean that looked for all the world like the axle had been bent in an impact. Or a rollover. It had not been bent. The tilt was a tolerance shift in the kingpin bushing, a wear pattern that could be corrected with a bushing replacement costing approximately $12 in parts and 3 hours of work. The axle itself was structurally sound, but because the tilt looked like impact damage, any buyer who had not specifically read the Oliver Service Bulletin from 1956, which described the issue and its fix in precise detail, would assume the axle was damaged and price accordingly. That bulletin was in Silas Carver's binder. Wyatt had read it for the first time in the winter of 1976. Then he had read it again in the spring of 1977, because he had the discipline of a boy who had already learned that reading something once was not the same thing as knowing it. He had the bulletin effectively memorized. He had done the math on what the fix would cost. He had sourced the bushings through a parts catalog at the implement supply in Colby and verified the price. $11.40. He had 3 hours. He had measured the front axle of lot 14 that morning with his folding ruler. The measurement matched the bulletin's description of the tolerance shift exactly. 4¼ inches of lateral cant at the wheel flange. The bulletin stated 4 to 4½ indicated bushing wear, not structural damage. The axle was not bent. The kingpin bushing was worn. The Oliver 88 in lot 14 was not a damaged tractor selling cheap. It was a perfectly functional tractor selling cheap because everyone looking at it had made the same incorrect assumption. And Wyatt Carver was the only person in that yard who knew why the assumption was wrong. Let me pause here and ask you something. Hollis Merritt had been buying and selling farm equipment for 14 years. The other serious bidders in that yard had decades of collective experience. They were not foolish men. They looked at the Oliver 88 and drew a reasonable conclusion from what they saw. A tilted front axle, a cheap price, a tractor worth buying for parts or not at all. They were reasoning from general knowledge. Wyatt was reasoning from specific knowledge. And the distance between those two things in that auction yard on that summer morning was the difference between a tractor worth $200 and a tractor worth considerably more. Have you ever known something so specifically, so completely, that it gave you an advantage that experience alone could not match? Not expertise in a broad sense, but precision. The kind of knowledge that comes from going all the way to the bottom of one subject instead of halfway through many. Silas Carver had taught his grandson to go all the way to the bottom. Wyatt had gone. And on a Tuesday morning in the summer of 1977, the bottom turned out to be worth more than anyone in that auction yard had imagined. Some stories only make sense once you have felt them. If this one is already speaking to you, stay with us. There is more ahead. The auction started at 9 o'clock sharp. The Siebert sale barn had shade on the west side and none on the east, and by 9:15, the east side was already uncomfortable. Most of the serious bidders had positioned themselves near the auctioneer's podium, where a box fan was running. Wyatt stood near lot 14. He had positioned himself with his back to the north fence, the Oliver 88 directly to his right, the auctioneer in his line of sight. He did not move. The lots ran in order. Equipment came up was described by the auctioneer from his catalog. Notes was bid on and sold or passed. The first 13 lots took 45 minutes. A grain auger went for 180. A planter went for 640. A post hole digger went for 55. A John Deere B that needed an engine rebuild. The auctioneer said it plainly from the podium went for 420 to a man who knew exactly what he was getting into. Then lot 14. The auctioneer walked the length of the north row to the Oliver 88, consulted his catalog sheet, and gave the crowd what he had. A 1953 Oliver 88. Engine runs. Front axle shows damage. Sold as is. Opening the bidding at $150. Silence. Nobody moved. The auctioneer, whose name was Darnell Shea, and who had been calling auctions in western Kansas for 27 years, adjusted his microphone and tried again. 100 then. Still nothing. $75. A parts dealer near the back raised his card. The kind of raise that means I will take it at this price, because I can sell the engine and the transmission separately for more than this. Shea had 80. Wyatt raised his paper slip. Not a card. He had not been given a card. He had been given a bidder number on a piece of paper, number 47. Folded in half, and he unfolded it now and raised it at chest height. Shea looked at him. A professional auctioneer's look. Not surprised, because Shea had been calling auctions long enough to have seen almost everything, but careful. I have 80 from the young man in the blue shirt. Do I hear 90? The parts dealer in the back raised his card. 90, Shea said. Wyatt raised his paper. 100. The parts dealer, who was 31 years old and named Perry Lunn, and who ran a salvage operation out of Russell, calculated the math of what he could extract from the machine against what he was paying for it, and raised his card again. 110, Shea said. Wyatt raised his paper. 120. Hollis Merritt had turned to watch. He was not bidding. He had passed on the Oliver at the preview, and he had no intention of bidding on it now. But he was curious. A boy bidding on a bent axle tractor with a coffee tin of money was at least interesting. He set down his catalog. He folded his arms. He watched. Perry Lunn went to 130. Wyatt went to 140. Lunn looked at his catalog sheet, then at the tractor, then at Wyatt, who was standing beside the Oliver 88, with his bidder paper raised and his expression absolutely calm. Lunn had a ceiling. He had done his math before the auction started, the way parts dealers always do. 140 was past his ceiling. He lowered his card. Shea scanned the yard. 140. Do I hear 150? Nothing. 140. Going once. Nothing. Going twice. Nothing. The gavel came down. Sold, Shea said to bidder number 47 for $140. The Oliver 88 went to Wyatt Carver, 16 years old, for $140, which left him $200 from his coffee tin. Enough to ride his bicycle home. Enough to fix what needed fixing. Enough, though, no one in that yard yet knew it to begin something. Hollis Merritt walked over. He did not hurry. He crossed the yard at the steady, measured pace of a man who had been walking auction yards for 14 years and saw no reason to move faster than he had always moved. He stopped a few feet from Wyatt. He looked at the Oliver 88. He looked at Wyatt. He said what he had come to say. "Son," he said, "that front axle is bent. You know that." Wyatt met his eyes. He did not look up to meet them. He was 16 and already almost as tall as Merritt, and he met the older man's eyes levelly, the way his grandfather had taught him to meet the eyes of a man who was speaking to him seriously. "The axle is not bent," he said. "The kingpin bushing is worn. Looks the same from the outside. Different problem entirely." Merritt looked at the front axle. Then he looked back at Wyatt. How do you know that? Oliver put out a service bulletin in 1956, Wyatt said. It describes this exact presentation in the 1952 and 1953 models. The tilt is a tolerance shift in the bushing, not impact damage. Axle itself is straight. I measured it this morning. Merritt was quiet for a moment. He was a man who understood equipment. And what he was hearing was technically specific in the way that only accurate information is specific. He looked at the tractor again. He looked at Wyatt. How much to fix it? $12 in parts, Wyatt said. Maybe 3 hours of work if I take my time. A few other men had drifted over. The auction was continuing behind them. Lot 15 was going under the hammer. But this conversation had become its own event, and 6 men who should have been watching the next lot were standing in a loose half-circle around Wyatt and Merritt, and the Oliver 88 instead. Orell Tipton was among them. Tipton said nothing. He just watched. Merritt studied Wyatt. "Where did you learn that?" he said. "My grandfather Wyatt said. Silas Carver, out of Thomas County. He kept every bulletin Oliver ever sent." Merritt's face changed. Just slightly. A small movement around the eyes that men who had known Silas Carver would have recognized. "I knew Silas," Merritt said. "Good man." "Yes, sir," said Wyatt. And then Hollis Merritt, 44 years old, 14 years, in the business, stuck out his hand, and Wyatt Carver, 16 years old. 4 hours into his first farm equipment auction, shook it. Merritt held the handshake for a beat longer than he needed to. Then he let go. He nodded once. He turned and walked back toward the auction. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. The handshake was the acknowledgement from a man who had been buying equipment since before Wyatt was born to a boy who knew something he had not known. The yard went back to its business. But something had shifted in the way the men in that yard looked at the boy standing next to the Oliver 88. It was not respect, exactly. Respect takes time. It was the thing that comes before respect. Recognition. A recalibration in a group of experienced men of what was possible. Wyatt stood next to the Oliver 88 with the receipt in his pocket and watched the rest of the auction. He did not bid on anything else. He did not need to. He had come for Lot 14, and he had Lot 14. He would arrange a flatbed trailer with a neighbor the following Saturday and retrieve the tractor. He would have it in his grandfather's equipment shed, his shed now really by noon that Saturday. He would order the bushings from the implement supply in Colby on Monday morning. He would fix the tractor over the course of one long Sunday in August. He would sell it 2 weeks later to a farmer 2 miles north of his place for $480, which was fair for a running Oliver 88 in its condition, and which he would get without negotiation. But all of that was still ahead. The auction was not yet over, and Wyatt Carver did not yet know that the hardest part of his day was not behind him. He thought the hard part had been the preview, the laughter, the bidding. He was about to learn that there are men in this world whose business is not farm equipment at all. Not really, but the capture of other men's work. and one of those men was watching him from the far side of the yard and had been watching him with a focused attention since the gavel came down. By the time the auction ended at 12:45, Wyatt had unfolded his bicycle lock and was preparing to arrange retrieval of his tractor. He walked to the Siebert office to confirm the flatbed arrangement. He walked back out into the yard. He was thinking about the shed at home. He was thinking about the bushing order. He was thinking about how he would tell his mother. He was not thinking about the man in the pressed khakis and the clean comfort boots who fell into step beside him as he crossed the yard toward his bicycle. "Son," the man said. "Got a minute?" Wyatt stopped, looked at him. The man was somewhere in his middle 30s. 35. Wyatt would learn later. He had a face that had spent very little time outside. His boots were expensive and had never seen a harvest. His shirt was ironed. His belt was tooled leather and a matching watch band on his left wrist. He had the clean-groomed presentation of a man who had driven to this auction from somewhere with paved parking lots and air-conditioned offices. "Garrett Voss," the man said. "Regional manager for Cornbelt Equipment Corporation. Out of Wichita." He extended a business card. Wyatt took it. He did not look at it. He was watching Voss's face. "Yes, sir," he said. Voss smiled. It was a practiced smile. Easy, confident, and placed carefully on his mouth, the way a picture is placed carefully on a wall. "That was some nice work you did on the Oliver," Voss said. "I watched the whole thing. Impressive for a young man your age." "Thank you," said Wyatt. "Tell you what Voss said. I'd like to make you an offer. Save you the trouble of hauling it home. Save you the parts order. Save you the 3 hours of work you mentioned. I'll give you $400 for it. Cash. Right now. You hand me the receipt, I hand you the money, and you ride home with $260 of profit in your pocket and your Saturday free." Wyatt looked at him. He looked at the Oliver 88 across the yard. He looked back at Voss. "Thank you, Mr. Voss," he said. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm going to keep the tractor." Voss's smile did not leave his face. It just became slightly more fixed. $420, he said. Wyatt shook his head. "Not the price, sir. I'm going to keep the tractor." Voss studied him for a moment. Then he did something Wyatt did not expect. He laughed. Short, low, the laugh of a man who had been amused by a small, unexpected thing. He reached up and straightened his shirt collar. He looked around the yard. He looked back at Wyatt. "Kid," he said, "this is a market. You understand what a market is. It is not a hobby. It is not a shed with your grandfather's binders in it. There are a lot of us in this market, and there is only so much used equipment worth having, and the small operators all eventually sell to the larger operators, because that is how markets work. You had a good day today. I am trying to help you walk away from it with a win. Don't mistake that." Wyatt said nothing. His hand had tightened on the bicycle lock without his permission. He made himself relax it. Voss waited. Then, when Wyatt did not answer, he nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "All right. Keep the tractor. Fix it. Sell it for whatever you sell it for. I will see you around." He put his card away. He smiled one last time, the same practiced smile. "Don't think you will play alone for long," he said. And then he turned and walked across the yard to a new model sedan parked at the far edge of the lot. And he got in, and he drove away. Wyatt stood where he was for a long moment. Then he walked to his bicycle. He unlocked it. He folded the lock and put it in his bag. He swung a leg over the frame. He began the 14-mile ride home. It was not until he was 3 miles east of the Siebert barn, pedaling steadily along a gravel county road, with the afternoon sun on his back, and the receipt for a 1953 Oliver 88 folded in his shirt pocket, and his coffee tin with $200 in it secured in his saddlebag, that he noticed his hands were shaking. Not from exertion, not from the heat. He stopped the bicycle. He stood in the middle of the empty county road. He looked at his hands. He waited for them to be still. He had walked into a sale barn that morning believing he understood what he was up against. Laughter. Skepticism. The difficulty of being 16 years old in a room full of men who had been buying and selling since before he was born. He had been ready for that. He had prepared for that. His grandfather had prepared him for that. He had not been ready for Garrett Voss. He had not been ready for a man in comfort boots with a practiced smile and a business card, who spoke about markets and mistakes, and small operators and larger ones, and who had watched the auction not to buy anything, but to watch him. Wyatt understood standing on that empty county road, with his hands slowly steadying themselves, that he had met something he did not yet know how to handle. And he understood with a clarity that felt older than he was, that he was going to have to learn. He got back on the bicycle. He rode the remaining 11 miles home. When he pulled into the yard, Marietta was on the porch. She had heard about the auction already. Oakley was a small town. Word traveled. She did not ask him what had happened. She just watched him ride up, and she watched him park the bicycle against the shed, and she watched him walk across the yard toward her with a paper receipt in his hand. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He held up the receipt. Marietta read it. She looked at her son. She did not smile. She did not frown. She just looked at him for a long moment in the late afternoon light. "Your grandfather," she said finally, "would be proud of you today." Wyatt nodded. He swallowed. He did not trust his voice yet. "But $140, she said, "and a tractor in the shed does not pay the bank." "No, ma'am," said Wyatt. Marietta looked out across the yard toward the shed, toward the open fields beyond it. She looked back at her son. "Come inside," she said. "I will heat up some supper. We will talk about what comes next." He climbed the porch steps. The screen door closed behind him. The sun dropped lower over the Thomas County fields, and somewhere on a highway between Colby and Wichita, Garrett Voss was driving home in his new sedan. And he was not thinking about Wyatt Carver at all, because he had not yet understood what it meant that a 16-year-old boy with a coffee tin had looked him in the eye and told him no. The Oliver 88 came home on a Saturday morning in the last week of July. Wyatt borrowed a flatbed trailer from a neighbor named Harlan Fikes, who had known Silas for 30 years and who had not asked any questions when Wyatt walked over on Friday evening and asked if he could use the trailer for one day. Fikes had handed him the keys to the pickup and said only bring it back with a full tank. Wyatt had brought it back with a full tank, plus $2 of gas money tucked into the seat cushion, because his grandfather had taught him that borrowing is a form of trust, and trust is a form of debt, and debt should be repaid with a small margin on top of what was owed. The tractor rolled off the trailer and into the equipment shed behind the Oakley house at 11:40 on that Saturday morning. Wyatt closed the shed door behind it. He stood in the cool half-dark with his hand on the Oliver's rear fender, and he looked at the machine for a long minute before he did anything else. Silas's tool chest was on the workbench against the north wall. The 43 binders were on the shelf above it, still in the order Silas had left them. The shop smelled of the same mix of old oil and dry hay and clean metal that it had smelled of for 40 years. Wyatt took a breath that went deeper than his lungs. Then he walked to the binder shelf and pulled down the Oliver volume and opened it to the 1956 service bulletin and set it on the workbench next to the tool chest. He opened the chest. He began selecting the tools he would need. The bushing replacement took 2 hours and 40 minutes. He had budgeted 3 hours and came in under. The bushings cost $11.40 at the implement supply in Colby, which he had picked up on the way home from the auction that Friday afternoon. He reassembled the front axle with the patience of a boy who understood that tightening one bolt incorrectly now meant diagnosing a phantom problem 6 months from now. He torqued to the bulletin specification. He walked the tractor out of the shed on a Sunday afternoon in early August and drove it up the county road half a mile and back. The front axle tracked straight. The engine ran with the steady, unhurried rhythm of something that had been properly maintained and was prepared to work indefinitely. He sold it in the second week of August to a farmer named Arlen Dowd, the same Arlen Dowd who had sat with Silas for an hour after finding him gone in his work chair 2 springs earlier. Dowd needed a second tractor for his son's use and could not afford a newer model. Wyatt asked $480, which was fair for a running Oliver 88 in its condition. Dowd paid without negotiation. Dowd had come to the Carver shed because he had heard Silas's grandson had bought a tractor at Siebert. He would have paid $550. He did not say so. When Dowd drove the Oliver off the Carver property, Wyatt stood in the yard and watched it go. Marietta watched from the porch. She did not say anything. When the tractor was out of sight down the county road, she walked out to where Wyatt was standing, and she put her hand on his shoulder. She kept it there for the count of 3. Then she took it away and went back inside to start supper. His $140 investment had returned $480 in 6 weeks. After parts and his own labor, his net was $328.60. He put $200 of it in his mother's bank envelope that Sunday evening without telling her. She found it Monday morning and did not ask where it had come from. She put it toward the September mortgage payment. He was 16 years old. By the time Wyatt started his senior year at Oakley High that fall, farmers who had not spoken to him before were stopping at the equipment shed with problems they could not solve themselves. Hollis Merritt came by in October. He did not bring a problem. He brought a proposition. He had taken in a 1948 Farmel M on trade engine, had a cracked block. He could not move it as it stood. He had heard Wyatt had expertise with older equipment. Was he interested in taking a look? Wyatt looked. He had a solution within 48 hours. They came to an arrangement on the kitchen table of the Oakley house with Marietta pouring coffee and signing nothing and watching everything. Wyatt would repair the Farmall for a split of the resale value. It sold in November for $390. Wyatt's share was $155. Marietta put it in the envelope. Meridian Bank was paid in October, November, and December without strain. For the first time since Thomas died, she did not wake up at 3 in the morning doing arithmetic. That winter, Wyatt spent his evenings in the shed and his days at school. And he did not think very much about what came after graduation because the decision had already been made. He graduated Oakley High in May of 1978 at 17 years old without making a formal decision about college because he had already made the decision without calling it one. He had been working on his grandfather's shed floor for 3 years, and he had read 43 binders twice through, and he had an arrangement with Hollis Merritt and 2 other dealers in Norton and Goodland, and he was going to do what he was already doing, except now he would do it full-time. In the first 12 months after graduation, he repaired 9 pieces of equipment through his dealer arrangements and 31 pieces of equipment directly for farmers in Thomas, Colby, and Sherman counties. He saved $1,840. He was almost keeping up with his mother's contributions to the mortgage. Almost. Not quite. But almost for a boy of 17 and then 18 was a number that made his mother put her coffee cup down one morning in the spring of 1979 and say to the kitchen wall, "Silas, you old bastard, I hope you are watching." Then came the John Deere 730. Percy Hatch farmed 320 acres south of Brewster in the eastern edge of Thomas County. He was 47 years old in the summer of 1979, married 3 children running a John Deere 730 diesel that had been his father's and his grandfather's before him. The 730 was a solid tractor. Hatch kept it maintained. In June of 1979, it began losing power under load. Hatch called the John Deere dealership in Colby. The dealer quoted him $1,100 to pull the injection pump and send it out for rebuild. Hatch did not have $1,100. He asked around. He heard about the Carver boy in Oakley. Wyatt came out on a Tuesday morning. He spent 3 hours with the tractor. He diagnosed an injection pump issue. He was confident of the diagnosis. He told Hatch he could pull the pump, ship it for rebuild, through his own supplier reinstall it, and have the tractor back in the field for $600, parts and labor. Hatch shook his hand on the quote. Wyatt pulled the pump. The rebuild came back clean. The pump tested good on the bench. Wyatt reinstalled it. He started the tractor. It ran for about 45 seconds, and then it began losing power again, exactly the same way it had been losing power before. Wyatt stood next to the running tractor and listened to it. He listened for a long time. He shut it down. He stood in Percy Hatch's equipment yard with his hands on the 730's hood, and he ran through his options. And he knew in the way you know a thing when you have gone all the way to the bottom of a subject that he had missed something. The pump was not the problem. The pump had probably never been the problem. He pulled his notebook. He read back through his diagnostic notes. He went back into Hatch's equipment yard. He asked Hatch if he could keep the tractor for another day. Hatch said yes, but he said it with less warmth than he had said it 3 days earlier. Wyatt drove the 730 at low throttle back to the Carver shed on a trailer he borrowed again from Harlan Fikes. He put the tractor in the shed. He pulled the John Deere binder. He read the full 240 pages of technical bulletins for the 730 diesel. He read them with the slow, focused attention of a man who knew he had missed something and did not yet know what. Somewhere on page 184 of that binder, he found what he had missed. A bulletin from 1961 describing a timing gear wear pattern that presented almost identically to injection pump failure. The fix was a timing gear replacement. $9 in parts. 4 hours of work. Wyatt closed the binder. He sat on the stool next to the workbench. He did not move for almost an hour. He had been wrong. He had charged Percy Hatch $600 for parts and labor on a pump that did not need rebuilding. He had billed against his own reputation, and he had been wrong. The money was the smaller problem. The money he could eat. He still had the rebuild invoice, and he would have to cover the difference out of his own savings, because he had told Percy Hatch that the job would cost $600, and he was not going to tell him it would now cost more. But the reputation was the larger problem, and the reputation he understood had just taken a real hit. He fixed the timing gear on a Wednesday. He drove the tractor back to Percy Hatch's place on a Thursday. The 730 ran clean. It ran clean at idle. It ran clean under load. It ran the way a well-maintained John Deere diesel ran when everything inside it was behaving. Percy Hatch stood next to the tractor with his arms crossed. How much, he said. No additional charge, said Wyatt. The original quote stands. I will also refund the rebuild cost. $240. I will bring it by end of the week. Hatch looked at him for a long time. He was not an unkind man. He was a man who had been managing a farm on thin margins for 23 years, and who had just watched his equipment sit for 8 days in the middle of his hay season, while an 18-year-old diagnosed his problem twice. You were wrong, Hatch said. The first time. Yes, sir, said Wyatt. Hatch nodded slowly. All right, he said. I appreciate the refund, but I won't be calling you again. Nothing personal, just the way it is. Yes, sir, said Wyatt. He drove home. Word of the Hatch job moved through Thomas and Colby and Sherman counties at the speed that news of a young man's failure always moves in rural places, which is about twice as fast as news of his successes. By the end of the week, Wyatt had lost 3 scheduled jobs. A grain auger rebuild he had been promised in Sherman County, a combine inspection in Thomas, a transmission job in Colby that he had been looking forward to, a Case 800 that he had never worked on before and had been excited to learn. The 3 farmers who canceled did not call him rude. They did not raise their voices. They called politely one after another across 2 days, and they said they had decided to go with a different mechanic, and they were sorry, and they hoped he would understand. He understood. He was polite on every call. He thanked them. He hung up the phone. On the second night of that week, he walked out to the equipment shed after supper. Marietta watched him go from the kitchen window. She did not follow. She had learned enough about her son in 3 years to know when he needed the shed and when he needed her. This was a shed night. Wyatt sat down on the stool next to the workbench. He did not turn on the overhead light. The shed was lit by the last orange light of the July evening coming in through the 2 west windows. Silas's tool chest was open on the bench where he had left it. The John Deere binder was still on the bench next to it, open to the page with the timing gear bulletin. Wyatt put his hands on his thighs, the way his grandfather had sat in that same shed at the end of long days, and he sat still for a very long time. He did not cry. He wanted to. He sat with the wanting and did not move into it. He was 18 years old, and he had spent 3 years building a reputation that one Tuesday morning diagnosis had just walked backward by an amount he could not yet measure. He had been careful. He had been thorough, and he had still been wrong. He thought about Percy Hatch's face. The way Hatch had said, "I won't be calling you again." Nothing personal. That had been the worst of it. The nothing personal. Because it had been personal to Wyatt in the way that all of his work was personal. But it had not been personal to Hatch. It had been business. And business was what Wyatt had been pretending by the quality of his work to be doing. Now he knew what doing business actually meant. It meant that even your best clients would walk away without malice if you gave them a reason. He sat for another hour. The shed grew dim and then dark, and still he did not turn on the light. He watched the last light leave the west windows. He watched his hands on his thighs become shapes in the dark. He understood sitting there that no one was going to come into the shed and tell him what to do next. Not his grandfather, not his mother, not Hollis Merritt. Silas was 4 years dead, and his mother was in the house, and Hollis Merritt had his own shed to worry about. Whatever happened next was going to happen because Wyatt decided to make it happen. Or it was not going to happen, and his work would go quietly away, and he would be a young man in Thomas County who had been briefly impressive and who had then gone back to being an ordinary mechanic, charging an ordinary rate for ordinary work that did not require 43 binders to accomplish. He stood up. He turned on the overhead light. He pulled the John Deere binder to the center of the workbench. He opened it to the timing gear bulletin. He read it again slowly, not because he did not understand it, but because he wanted to feel the shape of what he had missed. He picked up the notebook his grandfather had given him in 1974. He turned to a blank page near the back. He wrote in his own steady hand 2 lines. Timing gear first, pump second. Never reverse. He closed the notebook. He turned off the light. He walked back to the house. Marietta was at the kitchen table with her hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She looked up when he came in. "Supper's in the icebox," she said. "I ate," said Wyatt. "You didn't." "I ate enough." She studied him. Then she did something she almost never did. She pushed out the chair next to her, and she said, "Sit a minute." He sat. She did not look at him when she spoke. She looked at the coffee cup. "Silas was wrong sometimes," she said. "I saw him be wrong. More than once." There was a summer 1958. I think he spent 4 days on a combine for a neighbor out on Route 24, and he finally gave up and had the man take it to the case dealer in Goodland, and the case dealer fixed it in 3 hours for $80. Silas paid the $80 out of his own pocket. He never told the neighbor he had paid it. The neighbor assumed the dealer had given him a discount. Silas just ate it. Wyatt said nothing. "He didn't stop being," Silas, Marietta said. "He just knew one more thing than he had the week before." She took a sip of the cold coffee. She made a face. She got up and poured it in the sink. She stood with her back to him at the counter. "Do what your grandfather did," she said. "Eat it. Get back to work." "Yes, ma'am," said Wyatt. He went upstairs. He slept poorly. He got up at 5 the next morning, and he was in the shed by 5:30, and he began rebuilding a carburetor for a Ford 8N that was due back to its owner in Sherman County by the end of the week. And he did not think about Percy Hatch while he worked. He did not think about anything. He just did the work. 9 months later, in the spring of 1980, the situation had stabilized. The canceled jobs had not come back, but new jobs had come in to replace them. The farmers who had stayed with him had stayed because they understood that a mechanic who admits a mistake and refunds the difference is a different kind of risk than a mechanic who pretends he was right and charges you twice. Wyatt's reputation in Colby and Thomas counties had shifted, but it had not collapsed. He was no longer the prodigy who had bought an Oliver 88 at Siebert for $140. He was a young man with a serious shed and a serious approach, and a reputation for being wrong about John Deere diesels once in his life and never again. Never. He had also, in the 9 months since the Hatch job, added a full page to the inside cover of his personal notebook. The page was titled in his own hand, "Rules I Had to Learn." There were 9 rules on the page by the spring of 1980. He would add to it over the decades. He would never cross anything out. In April of 1980, a new sign appeared on Highway 24, 3 miles west of the Siebert sale barn. Cornbelt Equipment Corporation, Colby Regional Service Center. Grand opening July 1st. Wyatt saw the sign on a Saturday morning when he was driving to a job in Sherman County. He slowed the truck. He read the sign twice. He drove on. On July 1st, the Cornbelt Colby Regional Service Center opened for business. Garrett Voss cut the ribbon. The Colby Free Press ran a photograph on page 3. Voss, in a blue suit, scissors in hand, smile carefully placed. The article quoted him saying that Cornbelt was bringing modern equipment service to western Kansas farmers. Factory-trained technicians, full warranty coverage, transparent pricing. No more backyard mechanics. The phrase "no more backyard mechanics" appeared twice in the article. It was a phrase. It had been polished somewhere. It had come with Voss from Wichita. Within 60 days of the Cornbelt opening, Wyatt lost 3 more clients. Not to mistakes this time, to a sales pitch. Cornbelt sent representatives door to door in Thomas and Colby counties, handing out pamphlets explaining that a young independent mechanic, however talented, could not offer warranty coverage, could not offer factory-certified parts, could not offer the peace of mind that came with a corporate service relationship. Your equipment is your livelihood, the pamphlet said in large black letters. Don't trust it to an amateur. The word amateur did a lot of work in that pamphlet. Wyatt read the pamphlet at Hollis Merritt's kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in September of 1980. Merritt had brought it over. Merritt had read it 3 times before he had driven to the Carver place. He sat across from Wyatt with his hands flat on the table, and he said, "This is aimed at you." "Yes, sir," said Wyatt. "You know this man." "I met him in '77, said Wyatt. "After the Oliver." Merritt looked at this pamphlet. He looked at Wyatt. "What does he want?" "He wants me to stop," said Wyatt. Merritt nodded. He folded the pamphlet and put it back in his pocket. He drove home. He did not say anything else about it that night. But 2 weeks later, he drove to the Cornbelt Colby Regional Service Center at 10 in the morning on a Thursday. And he walked inside, and he spent 45 minutes looking at their service bay and talking to their counter staff. And he came out, and he drove to the Carver shed, and he told Wyatt what he had seen. 3 technicians in identical uniforms. A wall of parts that was mostly for tractors less than 10 years old. A counter manager who did not know what an Oliver 88 was. Prices for the few services they did offer that were roughly double what Wyatt charged. "They're not mechanics," Merritt said. "They're a parts warehouse with a service bay attached. He wants to be the only game in town, and he wants to charge whatever he wants to charge, and he's using the word amateur to do it." "Yes, sir," said Wyatt. Merritt looked at him. "You going to let him?" "No, sir," said Wyatt. In October of 1980, Garrett Voss drove out to the Carver place. He came alone. A new sedan, different from the one in 1977, but the same kind. He parked in the gravel in front of the equipment shed. He got out. He looked around. He was carrying a leather folio tucked under his left arm. He walked to the shed. Wyatt was inside tuning a Case 400 carburetor for a farmer in Goodland. Voss stopped at the open shed door. Wyatt Voss said, "It's Garrett Voss. Cornbelt. We met at Siebert in '77. Wyatt set down his screwdriver. He stood up. He wiped his hands on a shop rag. He walked to the shed door. He said, "Mr. Voss." Voss smiled. "Got a minute for me?" he said. Wyatt nodded once. He led Voss into the shed. He did not offer him a chair. Voss did not ask for one. Voss set his folio on the workbench next to Silas's tool chest, and he opened it. "I want to make you an offer," Voss said. A real one this time. Not like in '77. A serious offer. Wyatt waited. Voss pulled out a typed document, 2 pages. He set it on the workbench. Cornbelt would like to purchase your operation, Voss said. The equipment, the parts inventory, the tool chest you are standing next to, and those binders up there on the shelf. Everything. Turnkey. We would then hire you full-time as a senior service technician at our Colby Regional Center. Salary of $22,000 a year, plus benefits. Full health coverage. A company truck. Paid vacation. $8,000 cash for the operation and the contents of this shed. Wyatt did not look at the document, Kid Voss said, and his voice was softer now. Warmer, the voice of a man who had reached the part of his pitch where he began treating his audience like a friend. $22,000 is more than your father made in the last good year he had. It's more than your mother makes at the feed store and the trucking company combined. It's a career. It is what your grandfather would have wanted for you if he had lived to see the industry change the way it has changed. And it gets your mother's mortgage paid off in 3 years, not 10. Wyatt's eyes moved just once to the shelf of binders, then back to Voss. The binders aren't for sale, Wyatt said. Voss smiled the practiced smile. I understand the sentiment, he said. We can negotiate. We will store them. We will display them in the regional center. We will name the service counter after your grandfather. The Silas Carver service counter. Cornbelt would be honored. These things have value to us too. They're not for sale, said Wyatt. At any price. For any counter. Voss's smile did not leave his face. He closed the folio slowly. He looked around the shed. He looked at the tool chest. He looked at Wyatt. Think about it, he said. I will leave the paperwork. Take a week. Talk to your mother. She is a practical woman. She will see the sense in it. He set the document on the workbench. He picked up his folio. He walked out of the shed. He got in his sedan. He drove away. Wyatt stood in the shed for a long time after the sound of the sedan faded down the county road. He looked at the 2-page document on his workbench. He picked it up. He read every word of it twice. Then he folded it in half, and he folded it again, and he put it in the bottom drawer of the workbench underneath a stack of old invoices, where he would not see it again. He did not tell his mother about the offer. Not that week. Not the week after. He worked. He took jobs. He turned down one job, a generator repair, for a Cornbelt customer who was trying to get a second opinion on a $900 quote, because he understood, though he could not have explained, how that taking that job would be exactly what Voss wanted him to do. He would do the work well. The customer would go back to Cornbelt and say the backyard boy fixed it for $200, and Voss would have his next ad campaign, and it would have Wyatt's name on it. He declined. He told the customer respectfully that he was booked. He was not booked. In January of 1981, a farmer named Marlon Trask brought Wyatt a Massey Harris 44 that had been sitting in a fence row for 3 years. Trask wanted it running. He was willing to pay for parts and labor, both, he said, on a handshake, because his family had known the Carvers for generations, and a handshake between the Trasks and the Carvers had always been enough. Wyatt shook his hand. The job took 2 weeks. Parts came to $160. Labor at Wyatt's modest self-rate came to $180. Total $340. The same $340 that had been in the coffee tin on the morning of the Siebert auction. Wyatt did not notice the coincidence until later. Trask picked up the Massey Harris on a Friday afternoon in late January. He admired the work. He shook Wyatt's hand again. He said his check would be in the mail by Monday. The check did not come Monday. It did not come Tuesday. On Wednesday morning, Wyatt drove out to the Trask place. The house was empty. The barn was empty. The cattle were gone. A realtor's sign was in the front yard. The neighbor across the section said Trask had sold the farm to a corporate buyer the week before and had moved his family to Arizona on Sunday night. He said it the way a man says something he has been waiting 3 days to say. Wyatt drove home. He sat in the shed. He thought about the $340. He thought about a handshake between the Trasks and the Carvers. He opened his personal notebook. He turned to the page of rules. He added a 10th. Every job gets a written contract. No exceptions. He did not chase Trask. He did not call a lawyer. He did not speak his name to Hollis Merritt or Harlan Fikes or his mother. He ate the $340 the way his grandfather had eaten the $80 to the Goodland dealer in 1958, and he went back to work. But the page of rules in his notebook was 10 rules long now, and he read them every Sunday evening before he went to bed. In March of 1982, Marietta Carver came home from the Oakley Feed and Seed on a Thursday afternoon and sat down at the kitchen table and did not take off her coat. Wyatt came in from the shed 20 minutes later. He looked at her. He sat down across from her. "Meridian Bank called me today," she said. "Yes, ma'am. They asked if I knew that someone had made an inquiry about buying our mortgage note. From a party in Wichita." The kitchen was very quiet. Did they say who said Wyatt? They said they could not say. But the officer I spoke to has known us since Silas was alive, and he said off the record the party was a corporation. He said the name was Cornbelt Equipment Financial Services. Wyatt's hands were flat on the kitchen table. He did not move them. "Financial services," Marietta said. "A farm equipment company has financial services. They buy mortgages from farm wives whose sons inconvenience them." "Yes, ma'am," said Wyatt. Marietta looked at him across the table. For a long time. She did not look angry. She looked very still. Silas would not sell the chest, she said. "I will not sell the farm. You do what you need to do." She got up. She took off her coat. She hung it on the hook by the door. She started supper. She did not mention Cornbelt or Meridian Bank or Garrett Voss again that evening. But Wyatt sat at the kitchen table for another 20 minutes after she left it. He watched the light change across the wood of the table. He thought about a man in comfort boots on a Tuesday in July of 1977, saying this is a market. He thought about a pamphlet on Hollis Merritt's table saying no more backyard mechanics. He thought about the 2-page document folded in the bottom drawer of his workbench, and he understood with the same clarity he had felt on the empty county road 5 years earlier that Garrett Voss had finally done what Voss had been preparing to do for 5 years. He had found the pressure point. He had put his hand on it. He was waiting to see whether Wyatt would move. Wyatt did not yet know what he was going to do, but he knew sitting at that kitchen table in the March light of 1982 that the response was not going to be a phone call to Voss, and it was not going to be a lawyer, and it was not going to be a meeting. The response, when it came, was going to have to come from the binders. Silas had left him 43 of them. Wyatt had read every one twice. Somewhere in those binders, he understood, was the piece of knowledge that Voss did not have, and did not know he did not have, and could not buy no matter how many mortgages he tried to purchase. Wyatt just had to find it. He stood up from the kitchen table. He walked out to the shed. He turned on the overhead light. He pulled down the first binder on the left-hand end of the shelf, the 1947 Alice Chalmers volume, and he sat down at the workbench, and he began to read. The reading took 6 weeks. Wyatt did it in the evenings after the day's work was done from 7 until 11. Most nights later on Fridays and Saturdays. He worked through the binders in chronological order, not by manufacturer. He wanted to see how the industry had changed year by year. He wanted to see what had been known publicly and what had been quietly retired from the service bulletins over the decades. Silas had kept everything. Superseded bulletins, revised bulletins, original bulletins that the manufacturers had later softened or replaced with gentler language. The full paper trail of what Detroit and Moline and Racine had actually told their dealers over 40 years before the lawyers and the marketing departments had gotten their editing hands on the second printings. By the middle of April, he had narrowed his focus to Cornbelt's 3 biggest service revenue streams in western Kansas. Engine rebuilds on mid-60s and early 70s, John Deere diesels, hydraulic system overhauls on Case and International combines, transmission rebuilds on Alice Chalmers wheel tractors. He knew these were their 3 biggest revenue streams because Hollis Merritt had been quietly asking around for him. Merritt had not told Wyatt why he was asking. Wyatt had not told Merritt why he wanted to know. They understood each other without putting words to it. On a Thursday evening in the last week of April, Wyatt found what he had been looking for. It was in the John Deere binder, a service bulletin dated June of 1971. The bulletin was titled in the dry official language of John Deere, Technical Communications, Cylinder Head, Gasket Torque, Sequence 4020 and 43, 20 diesel engines. Revised procedure. It was 4 pages long. It described in precise detail a failure mode that had appeared in the 4020 and 4320 diesels through the late 1960s and early 1970s. The failure presented as a cracked block. The symptoms looked exactly like catastrophic engine failure. coolant in the oil, loss of compression. A block that appeared to a dealer's service technician looking at it in a service bay to be beyond repair and ready for replacement. It was not beyond repair. The root cause, the bulletin explained, was a head gasket torque sequence error that had been introduced in the 1967 service manual and not corrected until this 1971 bulletin. The correct procedure applied to an engine that had been damaged by the incorrect procedure restored full function in approximately 90% of cases. Parts cost approximately $40. Labor approximately 6 hours. Wyatt read the bulletin 3 times. Then he pulled down the John Deere binder from 1972 and 1973 and 1974 and 1975. In the 1973 binder, he found a second bulletin. The 1971 bulletin had been superseded. The new bulletin from March of 1973 described the same symptoms, but recommended a different remedy. Block replacement. Approximate parts cost $2,400. Approximate labor, 40 hours. The 1971 bulletin had been withdrawn. Wyatt sat very still at the workbench. He understood what he was looking at. He understood it the way a man understands a thing when 20 years of reading have prepared him to understand it in one moment. John Deere had discovered between 1971 and 1973 that correcting the torque procedure in the field was cheaper for farmers and less profitable for dealers. The superseded bulletin had been replaced with a recommendation that produced $2,400 of dealer revenue per repair instead of $40. And somewhere in Colby, Kansas, in the summer of 1982, Cornbelt Equipment Corporation was quoting cracked block repairs on 402 and 432 diesels at $2,400 each. Wyatt copied the 1971 bulletin. He copied the 1973 bulletin that had replaced it. He put the copies in a manila envelope. He put the envelope in the top drawer of the workbench. He turned off the light. He told no one. Not yet. The Adelia Strickland job came to him 3 weeks later. Hank Strickland had farmed 920 acres northeast of Levant for 41 years. He had died in April of 1982 of a heart attack in his own equipment yard at 63 years old, 2 days after he had started prepping his combine for the coming harvest. Adelia, his wife, was 58 years old. She had been married to Hank for 39 years. She had 3 grown children, 2 in Kansas City and 1 in Denver. She had a Case 1370 combine that Hank had bought new in 1976 and had maintained himself ever since. The combine had stopped working on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of May. Wheat harvest was 8 days away. Adelia had called Cornbelt in Colby because it was the closest service center. A Cornbelt technician had come out on Wednesday. He had spent 3 hours with the combine and had written her a quote. $2,800 to replace the engine. 5 days assuming parts availability. She had not signed the quote. She had, on the recommendation of her neighbor, Orell Tipton, the same Orell Tipton who had watched Wyatt at the Siebert preview in 1977, called Wyatt Carver. Wyatt arrived at the Strickland place at 7 in the morning on a Thursday. He met Adelia on the porch of the farmhouse. She was a small, steady woman in a faded blue work dress. She shook his hand the way farm wives shake hands. Firm brief, already turning toward what needed doing next. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am," said Wyatt. "Thank you," she said. "The combine is in the machine shed. I'll walk you out." She walked him out. She did not speak on the walk. She opened the shed door. She stood back. Wyatt went to work. He spent 2 hours on the combine that morning. He checked everything the Cornbelt technician would have checked. He checked a number of things the Cornbelt technician had not. He found what he was looking for in the header drive assembly: a cracked shaft. He found, secondarily, a concave adjustment that had drifted out of spec, probably from the vibration created by the cracked shaft. The engine was fine. The engine had never been the problem. The engine had just been the most expensive thing a technician could suggest replacing. He came back to the farmhouse porch. Adelia was sitting in the porch chair with a cup of coffee. "It's not the engine, ma'am," said Wyatt. "It's a header drive shaft and a concave adjustment. Parts will run about $180. Labor will be about 18 hours if I work straight through. I can have it running by Saturday morning." Adelia looked at him. She held the coffee cup in both hands. "The Cornbelt man said it was the engine," she said. "He said $2,800. "I know what he said, ma'am. I looked at the engine." "The engine is not the problem." She was quiet for a long moment. "How sure are you?" she said. "I am sure," said Wyatt. She nodded once, slowly. "All right," she said. "Do the work. I will pay you Saturday morning if the combine runs." He worked through Thursday, and through Thursday night, and through Friday, and through Friday night, and into Saturday morning. He slept 4 hours total across the 2 nights on a cot Adelia set up for him in the equipment shed. Adelia brought him coffee at 3 in the morning on Friday, and again at 4 in the morning on Saturday. She did not ask him questions. She just set the coffee on the workbench and left. At 6:40 on Saturday morning, Wyatt fired up the case 137. It ran clean. He ran it up through all the gears at idle. It ran clean. He ran it up to working RPM. It ran clean. He drove it out of the shed into the yard and ran the header up and down 4 times. Everything worked. He shut it down. He walked to the farmhouse porch. Adelia was there with her coffee. She had probably been there since 3. "It's done, ma'am," he said. She nodded. She stood up. She walked with him back to the shed and watched him demonstrate the combine. She walked back to the house. She came out with a checkbook. She wrote him a check for $180 for parts and $180 for labor. She handed it to him. "This is less than you deserve," she said. "This is what I quoted, ma'am," said Wyatt. She looked at him for a long moment. Hank used to say she said that the difference between a man and a businessman is that a businessman charges you what the market will bear. A man charges you what the work was worth. She put her hand on his forearm just briefly. "Hank would have liked you," she said. She went back inside. Wyatt drove home. He slept for 11 hours. He woke up and ate supper with his mother at 9 o'clock on Saturday night. He did not tell her about the job in detail. He just said that he had finished a combine for Adelia Strickland in time for harvest. Marietta nodded. She had already heard about it. Oakley was a small town. Word traveled. Adelia Strickland brought in her wheat on the Monday of the last week in May. She had 3 neighbors come in to help. One of them was Orell Tipton. Tipton told the story to 4 other farmers at the Colby grain elevator that Friday. Those 4 farmers told it to 6 more at the Thomas County diner the following week. By the second week of June, the story of the case, 1370, and the Cornbelt $2,800 quote, and the Wyatt Carver $360 fix had reached most of the farming households in Thomas, Colby, and Sherman counties, and some of the households in Sheridan and Rawlins counties too. It was not a story about Wyatt exactly. It was a story about Cornbelt. It was a story about what Cornbelt had said a repair would cost, and what a repair had actually cost. The story did not contain any accusations. It did not need to. Farmers told it, and other farmers did the math themselves. In the last week of June, a Cornbelt mailer arrived at every farm household in Thomas and Colby counties. The mailer was titled Farmer Appreciation Day, Cornbelt Equipment Regional Service Center, July 17th. The mailer invited farmers to a free barbecue lunch, a tour of the service facility, a demonstration of the new John Deere 4840 tractor that Cornbelt had just taken in for display, and in smaller print near the bottom, a candid conversation with Cornbelt Regional Manager Garrett Voss about the state of independent equipment service in western Kansas. Hollis Merritt brought Wyatt a copy of the mailer on a Wednesday evening. "He is going to come at you in public," Merritt said. "At his own barbecue, in front of 80 farmers." "I know," said Wyatt. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going," said Wyatt. Merritt looked at him for a long moment. He set the mailer on the kitchen table. He said, "I am going too." "You don't have to," said Wyatt. "I know I don't," said Merritt. The Farmer Appreciation Day was held on a Saturday. The Cornbelt parking lot had been swept and striped for the occasion. A row of folding tables had been set up along the front of the service center, draped with red and white checkered cloths loaded with hamburgers and potato salad, and a large aluminum drink dispenser full of iced tea. A portable podium had been set up under a canopy at the end of the service bay. The new 4840 was parked next to the podium green paint, polished to catch the midday sun. 87 farmers attended. Most of them came in pickups. Most of them brought their wives. Hollis Merritt drove himself in his own truck. Wyatt drove his mother's pickup. Marietta had asked him that morning at breakfast whether she should come with him. He had thought about it for a long moment. Then he had said, "No, ma'am. I need to stand this one on my own." She had nodded once. She had not pressed. She had said, "Come home for supper." "I'll wait." The crowd ate. The crowd toured the service bay. The crowd admired the 4840. At 2 in the afternoon, Garrett Voss stepped up to the podium. He was wearing a blue blazer over a white shirt open at the collar. He tapped the microphone. He smiled the practiced smile. "Friends," Voss said. "Neighbors. Fellow folks who make their living from this land." He spoke for 10 minutes. He spoke about the future of farming, about the challenges of modern equipment, about the importance of factory-trained service, about the peace of mind that came with a corporate service relationship. He was a good speaker. He had done this before. He used his hands well. He looked at different sections of the crowd as he spoke, giving each farmer in turn the feeling of being addressed directly. Then he came to the part Hollis Merritt had warned Wyatt about. "There has been," Voss said, "some talk lately about independent service providers in this region. Backyard mechanics, some people call them. Some of you may have even used one. I want to be fair about this. Some of these folks are talented. I will not deny that. But I want to ask you a question. Would you trust your $400,000 operation, the land you have built over generations, to a young man working out of a shed with no warranty, no factory certification, no liability coverage? Because that is what independent service is. It is a handshake in a shed." A few farmers in the crowd shifted their weight. "I have been watching one young man in particular," Voss said. "Talented fellow. 16 years old when he got lucky on an Oliver 88 at Siebert 5 years ago. He has been riding that luck ever since. And I wish him well, I truly do. But I want to say here in front of all of you that luck is not a business model, and a handshake is not a warranty, and a shed is not a service facility. At some point, friends, the American farmer has to decide what kind of industry he wants to support." Voss paused. He looked very deliberately toward the back of the crowd, where Wyatt was standing next to Hollis Merritt. "In fact," Voss said, "I believe the young man I am referring to is here today. Wyatt, would you like to come up and say a few words? I would welcome the conversation." The crowd turned. Wyatt did not hurry. He looked at Hollis Merritt. Merritt looked back at him and nodded once. Wyatt handed Merritt the manila envelope he had been holding at his side all morning. Merritt took it. Wyatt walked forward through the crowd. The crowd parted for him. He reached the podium. Voss stepped aside with the gracious posture of a man yielding the floor. Wyatt did not step up to the microphone. He stood beside the podium at ground level facing the crowd. Hollis Merritt walked up behind him and handed him the manila envelope and stepped back. Wyatt opened the envelope. He took out 2 documents. He held them at his side. He spoke without a microphone. He did not need one. He had the kind of voice that carried when it had something to say. "Good afternoon," he said. "My name is Wyatt Carver. I am 21 years old. I live outside Oakley. I fix farm equipment out of my grandfather's shed. Mr. Voss is correct that I got lucky on an Oliver 88 at Siebert in 1977. I paid $140 for a tractor that other bidders thought was worth less than that, because I had read a service bulletin from 1956 that most of them had not read. I sold it for $480 6 weeks later to Arlen Dowd, who is standing over there next to the iced tea table. Arlen, I hope the tractor is still running." From the crowd, Arlen Dowd, now 67 years old, raised his hand. "Running fine," he said. A few people smiled. Mr. Voss says luck is not a business model, Wyatt said. He is right. Reading is a business model. I have read every technical bulletin my grandfather collected between 1947 and last year. There are 43 binders of them on a shelf in my shed. I know that because I have read them twice, and some of them 3 times, and I take notes. He held up the first document. This, he said, is a John Deere service bulletin from June of 1971. It describes a failure mode on 4020 and 4320 diesel engines that presents as a cracked block. The bulletin explains that the presentation is caused by a head gasket torque sequence error. It provides a corrective procedure. Parts approximately $40. Labor approximately 6 hours. The bulletin states that the corrective procedure restores full engine function in approximately 90% of cases. He held up the second document. This, he said, is a John Deere service bulletin from March of 1973. It covers the same failure mode. It supersedes the 1971 bulletin. It no longer recommends the corrective procedure. It recommends block replacement. Approximate parts cost $2,400. Approximate labor 40 hours. The crowd was very quiet. Mr. Voss said, Wyatt, I know that Cornbelt has quoted 3 cracked block repairs on 402. 432. Diesels in Thomas and Colby counties this calendar year. I know the names of the farmers you quoted. I know what you quoted them. 2 of them paid, and 1 of them did not. The one who did not paid me to do the corrective procedure from the 1971 bulletin instead. His engine has been running since March. Parts cost him $42. Labor cost him $180. The silence in the parking lot was the kind of silence that happens in a room of experienced men who have just done math in their heads. I am not accusing you of anything, said Wyatt. You may not have known about the 1971 bulletin. Cornbelt's technicians may not have known. The 1973 bulletin superseded it, and most dealer service networks only reference the current bulletin. That is a reasonable mistake for a factory-trained service organization to make. I understand that. Wyatt paused. But I want to say something he said about what Mr. Voss called a handshake in a shed. He turned slightly, so that he was speaking as much to Voss as to the crowd. A handshake in a shed, he said, is the oldest business model in farming. It is not inferior to a warranty. It is different. My grandfather shook hands with farmers in this county for 40 years. My father shook hands for the 14 years he was able to. I have been shaking hands for 5. When I shake a farmer's hand on a job, I am telling him that I know what I am doing, that I will tell him the truth about his equipment, that I will charge him what the work is worth, and not what the market will bear, and that if I am wrong, I will make it right. I have been wrong before Mr. Voss. I was wrong in 1979 on a John Deere 730 for Percy Hatch. I refunded the difference. I learned from it. Percy Hatch has not hired me back, and he has that right. But I have not made that mistake again, and I have added a page of rules to my notebook since then. and I will keep adding to it for as long as I work." Wyatt turned back to the crowd. "I am not here," he said, "to ask anybody in this parking lot to stop using Cornbelt. That is not my place, and it is not my business. I am here because Mr. Voss asked me to come up and say a few words. I have said them. Thank you." He folded the 2 documents. He handed them back to Hollis Merritt. He walked off the concrete pad. He did not look at Voss as he walked past him. A farmer at the edge of the crowd, a man in his 50s named Rupert Vance from north of Brewster, set down his plate of potato salad on a folding table and walked to his truck and drove away. A second farmer did the same thing 2 minutes later, then a third. By the time Wyatt reached his mother's pickup at the far end of the parking lot, 12 trucks had started their engines and pulled out. Hollis Merritt walked with him. Merritt did not speak. He just walked. At the pickup, Wyatt stopped. He turned and looked back toward the podium. Garrett Voss was still standing there. He was not smiling. He was looking at the remaining crowd, which had thinned by half, and he was holding the microphone with one hand, and he was not speaking. His face had the particular stillness of a man who was calculating what the next 6 months of his life were going to look like. Wyatt got in the truck. Merritt stood at the driver's window. Son Merritt said, "Yes, sir. You just cost that man his career." Wyatt thought about it. "No, sir," he said. "He cost himself his career." "I just read." Merritt looked at him for a long time. Then he put his hand on the window frame. "Drive careful," he said. "Yes, sir," said Wyatt. He drove home. Marietta was on the porch when he came up the driveway. She had a cup of coffee. She did not stand up. "How did it go?" she said. He sat down next to her on the porch steps. He looked out across the yard. "It went," he said. She did not press. She sat with him for 10 minutes in the late afternoon light without speaking. Then she got up and went inside. Put supper on the table. 6 months later, in January of 1983, the Cornbelt Colby Regional Service Center closed. A bankruptcy notice appeared on the front door on a Wednesday morning. The word Cornbelt in white vinyl letters across the front window was peeled off the following week by 2 men in a small box truck, and the window was lettered by the end of the month with the name of a feed cooperative that had bought the building at auction. Garrett Voss moved to Denver. Meridian Bank in February of 1983 called Marietta Carver and informed her that the inquiry from the Wichita party had been withdrawn. She thanked the officer politely. She hung up. She finished the breakfast dishes. Wyatt opened Carver Agricultural Services on the first Monday of April 1983. He was 22 years old. He rented a 4-bay service building on the eastern edge of Oakley, on a gravel lot next to the feed store. He kept Silas's shed at the farm. He did not plan to stop working out of the shed. The new building was for the parts counter, the bookkeeping office, and the overflow. The real work would still happen in the shed. That had been Silas's shed. It would be his shed as long as he had one. Marietta did not cut a ribbon on opening day. There was no ribbon. She walked into the front office at 8 in the morning with a small cardboard box under her arm. She set the box on the front counter. Wyatt opened it. Inside the box was the coffee tin. The same coffee tin, a Folgers 2-pound can, with the red plastic lid that had carried $340 in saved money to the Siebert sale barn on a Tuesday morning in July of 1977. It was clean. It was empty. Marietta had kept it in the pantry for 6 years. For the front counter, she said. For luck. Wyatt did not answer. He set the tin on the shelf above the cash register. It stayed there for the next 11 years. From 1983 to 1994, Carver Agricultural Services became what Silas Carver's grandson could make it into when no one was trying to buy it from him anymore. Wyatt took on one employee in 1984, a Thomas County boy named Ernest Vickers, who had grown up 2 miles from the Carver place and had started following Wyatt around the shed the way Wyatt had once followed Silas. By 1987, he had 3 employees. By 1990, he had 5. He never advertised. He did not need to. In rural western Kansas, word of a man who could fix what the dealerships could not was better advertising than anything he could have purchased. The binders grew. He found 2 more in a barn sale in Sheridan County in 1986. He found 3 in an estate auction in Rawlins County in 1988. By 1991, he had 61 binders on the shelf above the workbench in Silas's old shed. He organized them the way Silas had taught him. He read the new ones twice before they went on the shelf. He made notes in the margins. He added them to his own reading list, and he read them again every 5 years. Hollis Merritt retired from the equipment dealership in Colby in the first week of May of 1994. He was 61 years old. On the Friday of his last working week, he drove out to the Carver shed at 10 in the morning. Wyatt was working on a Case 930 transmission. He stopped when Merritt pulled up. He wiped his hands. He walked out to meet him. "Last day," Merritt said. "Yes, sir," said Wyatt. "Thought I would stop by." They stood in the yard in the May sunshine. Merritt looked at the shed. He looked at the new building at the edge of Oakley that he could see 2 miles away. He looked back at Wyatt. "I almost didn't shake your hand that day." At Siebert, Merritt said, "77. I thought you had gotten lucky." "I did get lucky," said Wyatt. "Lucky my grandfather kept his bulletins." Merritt shook his head. "No," he said. "You got lucky that you read them." He stuck out his hand. Wyatt shook it. Merritt held the handshake for a beat longer than he needed to. Then he let go. He nodded once. He walked back to his truck. He drove away. Wyatt stood in the yard for a long moment after the sound of the truck faded. Then he went back to the Case 930 transmission. At 3:40 that same afternoon, a boy on a bicycle came up the driveway. He was 13 years old. He was lanky in the way 13-year-old farm boys are lanky. He was sunburned across the bridge of his nose. His work boots were slightly too large for him. He parked his bicycle against the shed wall. He had a spiral notebook in his hand. He stood at the open shed door, and he waited. Wyatt set down his wrench. He stood up. He wiped his hands on a shop rag. He walked over. "Afternoon," he said. "Afternoon, sir," said the boy. "What is your name?" said Wyatt. "Tobias Renner," said the boy. "I live 8 miles west of here on the old Renner place. My dad has a case 930. He says the hydraulic pump is shot. The dealer in Colby says the hydraulic pump is shot. They quoted us $2,200 to replace it." Wyatt waited. "I think it is the pressure relief valve," said Tobias. "I have been reading about it. In an old case service manual my dad has in the shed. I think the pressure relief valve is stuck open. I do not think the pump is bad." Wyatt looked at the boy for a long moment. "How did you get here?" he said. "I rode," said Tobias. 8 miles. Does your dad know you are here?" "No, sir. He does not believe me about the valve. He is going to pay the $2,200 on Monday." Wyatt looked at the bicycle leaning against the shed wall. He looked at the spiral notebook in the boy's hand. He looked at the shed behind him, the shelf of binders, the tool chest on the workbench, the case 930 transmission he had been working on when Hollis Merritt had driven up. "Come here," he said. He led Tobias into the shed. He walked to the shelf. He pulled down the case binder, the one that covered the 900 series. He walked to the workbench. He opened the binder to a specific page. He turned it so the boy could see. "This," he said, "is a case service bulletin from 1969. It describes exactly what you just described. Pressure relief valve sticks open. Present says pump failure. Fix is a $12 valve and about 2 hours of work." Tobias looked at the page for a long time. Then he looked up at Wyatt. "Sir," he said, "how did you know which binder to pick?" "I have read them all," said Wyatt. "Twice. You do not get to guess which binder. You get to know which binder, because you have been reading your way through them for 20 years. There is no shortcut. There is only the reading." Tobias nodded. "Can I see the binder?" he said. Wyatt slid it across the workbench to him, and then Wyatt Carver, 33 years old, stood in the equipment shed his grandfather had built in 1948, and watched a 13-year-old boy with a spiral notebook begin reading a service bulletin from 1969, and felt the shape of the thing his grandfather had started and his father had carried for the 14 years he was able to carry it, and he himself had carried for 19 years, settle quietly into another pair of hands. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "When you are done with that one, I will show you the next one." The deepest knowledge is never the widest. It is the kind that goes all the way to the bottom of one true thing and stays there long enough to understand it. Silas Carver knew that. He taught it to a grandson who had no way of knowing on a cold December afternoon in 1974 that he was being handed a life. The grandson learned it, and he carried it, and he did not sell it when a man in comfort boots came to his shed with $8,000 and a contract. He did not sell it when a corporation tried to buy his mother's mortgage. He did not sell it when a practiced smile in a blue blazer told 80 farmers in a parking lot that luck was not a business model. He kept reading. he kept working. He kept the binders on the shelf. And on a Friday afternoon in the spring of 1994, when a boy on a bicycle came up his driveway with a spiral notebook and a diagnosis he was not quite sure of, Wyatt Carver did the only thing a man who has been carrying a gift can do with it. He opened the binder. He turned the page. He began to teach. That is how it travels. Not in schools, not in showrooms, not in parking lot speeches. In sheds between one pair of hands and another, the way it has always traveled. A coffee tin on a summer morning in 1977. A handshake in a sale yard. A grandfather's chest full of 40 years of tools. A boy who rode 14 miles to an auction because his mother needed the truck and came home with a tractor and a lesson and the first page of a life that would eventually fill 61 binders and teach a boy named Tobias Renner how to read a pressure relief valve. The land does not remember the men in blue blazers. The land remembers the men who kept reading